If you've been following the next generation of weight loss medications, you have probably heard about Retatrutide. I know we talk about it here quite a bit. It is the experimental drug from Eli Lilly that has been generating enormous buzz because in clinical trials, the amount of weight loss has been pretty remarkable. And now there is some more big news. Eli Lilly has announced that a limited number of patients may be able to receive Retatrutide before the drug is approved by the FDA. But before anyone gets too excited, there is a very important catch here. This is not Retatrutide going on the market early. This isn't a program where you can call your doctor and say, hey, I'd like to try Retatrutide. This is what is called expanded access, sometimes referred to as compassionate use, and the eligibility requirements are extremely strict. So today we are going to talk about what just happened, who may qualify, how this process actually works, and what this could mean for Retatrutide's path toward FDA approval. On August 3rd, Eli Lilly confirmed that it has established an expanded access program for Retatrutide. The company says it will consider requests for a limited number of patients who meet specific medical criteria and who cannot participate in clinical trials. And this announcement didn't come out of nowhere. It follows a pretty unusual situation involving a single 79-year-old patient who was previously granted special access to Retatrutide. That case was reported by Stat News and generated a lot of questions from physicians who were asking essentially, if one patient can receive Retatrutide before FDA approval, what about other patients with severe obesity who have exhausted their treatment options? Several doctors reportedly sought access for their own patients, and now Lilly has publicly acknowledged a formal expanded access pathway. So this is a significant change, but it is important to understand what expanded access actually means. First, let's clear up the biggest possible misconception. Retatrutide is still an investigational drug. It has not been approved by the FDA for routine treatment of obesity. What Lilly has done is make it possible for certain physicians to request access for certain patients under the FDA's expanded access framework. The FDA describes expanded access as a pathway that can allow patients with serious or life-threatening conditions to receive an investigational medical product when they can't participate in a clinical trial and there aren't comparable or satisfactory treatment alternatives. And there are safeguards built into that process. The manufacturer has to agree to provide the drug. The physician has to submit the appropriate requests to the FDA. And there also needs to be appropriate ethics review and informed consent. So this is very different from getting an FDA-approved medication from your local pharmacy. In fact, for a standard non-emergency single-patient expanded access request, the FDA says that treatment generally cannot begin until 30 days after the application is received, unless the FDA allows treatment to proceed earlier. Emergency requests have a different process. So again, expanded access does not mean Retatrutide has been approved. It means there is a tightly controlled pathway for a very small number of patients who may have no other reasonable option. This is where I think some of the headlines can be misleading, and we really need to be careful here. Lilly is not opening Retatrutide to everyone who wants it. The company says eligible patients must be adults and have refractory obesity. In other words, obesity that has not responded adequately to available treatment. According to Lilly's criteria, as reported by Reuters, the patient must have refractory obesity despite tolerating the highest approved dose of an obesity treatment. They also must have at least 2 serious or life-threatening obesity-related complications for which they are currently receiving medical care. And there is another very important requirement. The patient must be unable to participate in an ongoing clinical trial of Retatrutide or a comparable investigational treatment. Some reporting also describes a requirement that standard treatment options, including bariatric surgery, have been discussed with the patient. And there have been some variations in exactly how different outlets have described the criteria, so I want to be very careful here. For example, some reports have specifically cited a BMI of 35 or higher as part of the program's definition of refractory obesity, while Lilly's public comments quoted by Reuters emphasize failure of the highest approved dose of obesity therapy. So if you are wondering whether you personally qualify, do not rely on a list from YouTube or even a news article. This is something that your physician would have to determine based on Lilly's actual program requirements and your medical situation. And even meeting the criteria does not necessarily mean you automatically receive the medication. You might be wondering, if Retatrutide is showing such impressive results, why not just let more people use it? Well, this is where the distinction between promising clinical trial results and an FDA-approved medication becomes really important. Retatrutide has produced some extraordinary weight loss numbers, but researchers are still learning about the medication. And when a drug is not yet FDA-approved, there are still questions about its full safety profile, the risks of longer-term use, and how those risks compare with the potential benefits in different groups of patients. That is one reason clinical trials are so important. They give researchers controlled environments in which to study safety and effectiveness. And some obesity specialists have actually expressed concern about expanded access. Their argument is basically, why expose patients to an investigational drug outside a clinical trial when the FDA approval process is specifically designed to establish its safety and effectiveness? Other physicians have a different perspective. They point out that there are patients with severe refractory obesity and serious complications who have exhausted approved options. For those patients, an investigational treatment may potentially represent an additional option when there aren't satisfactory alternatives. And that's really the purpose of expanded access. It's not supposed to replace the normal FDA approval process. It's intended for exceptional circumstances. So let's take a moment to talk about why Retatrutide has generated so much excitement in the first place. Retatrutide is different from medications like Zepbound because it targets 3 hormone receptors: GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon. That is why you will often hear it is called a triple-agonist. Zepbound or tirzepatide targets GLP-1 and GIP. Retatrutide adds glucagon to that combination. And the clinical trial results have been impressive. In one phase 3 trial involving adults with severe obesity and established cardiovascular disease, participants receiving the highest studied dose lost an average of 22.6% of their body weight after 80 weeks. In another phase 3 trial involving people with obesity or overweight and type 2 diabetes, the highest dose produced an average weight loss of 20.8% at 80 weeks. Those are averages, of course. They don't mean everyone taking Retatrutide will lose that amount of weight. And they certainly don't mean that someone taking it outside of a clinical trial should expect the same results. But these results help explain why there is so much anticipation surrounding this drug. Lilly says it plans to submit Retatrutide for FDA approval in the first quarter of 2027. So we're potentially getting much closer to the point where we will find out whether Retatrutide actually becomes an FDA-approved treatment. And this brings us to the question I know a lot of people are going to have. What if I'm taking Zepbound or Wegovy and I am not losing enough weight? Can I get Retatrutide? For the overwhelming majority of people, the answer is going to be no. Not through this expanded access program. Simply wanting greater weight loss isn't enough of a reason. Being frustrated with your current medication isn't enough. Even being interested in retatrutide isn't enough. The program is designed for people with serious medical needs who have refractory obesity, significant obesity-related complications, and limited or no access to an appropriate clinical trial. And there's another reason I think it's important to emphasize this. We've already seen enormous demand for these medications. So it's very possible that people will start contacting their doctors asking for retatrutide simply because they have heard it's the next big thing. But some physicians quoted in the reporting are already warning that this could create an avalanche of requests. And I think that's something worth keeping in mind. If your current medication is working for you, this announcement isn't a reason to suddenly decide that you need retatrutide. There's also another issue here that I think is extremely important. The excitement surrounding retatrutide has already created a market for products claiming to contain the drug, even though retatrutide is not FDA approved. And this is where I would be extremely cautious. There is a huge difference between receiving an investigational drug supplied by Eli Lilly through a formal expanded access program under physician supervision, of course, and the FDA's regulatory framework, and purchasing something online or through an unknown source that claims to be retatrutide. Those two things are not equivalent. One of the reasons some physicians have expressed support for a tightly controlled expanded access program is precisely because it keeps patients within the medical system, where the product source, dosing, monitoring, and adverse events can be more carefully managed. That doesn't mean expanded access is risk-free, of course. It means it's very different from taking an unapproved product from an unknown source. And personally, I think that's an important distinction for anyone that's following this story. So what happens now? Lilly says it is actively reviewing requests from healthcare providers for patients who meet its criteria. Meanwhile, retatrutide continues moving through the FDA approval process. Lilly plans to submit its application in the first quarter of 2027, and that's just around the corner. And if that happens, the FDA will then have to review the company's data and make its own determination about whether the benefits of retatrutide outweigh its risks for the proposed uses. So while expanded access is a big development, I don't think we should interpret it as a signal that the FDA approval is guaranteed. It certainly isn't, but it does tell us something interesting. Lilly believes there are some patients with severe treatment-resistant obesity for whom access to this investigational medication may be medically appropriate before that approval decision is made. And I have heard from many people that are treatment-resistant to everything that's out there currently, and they are just waiting for retatrutide to become available. I know there is going to be a lot of interest in this story, especially from people who have been following retatrutide for months or even years. So of course I would love to know what you guys think. Does expanded access make sense for patients with severe treatment-resistant obesity who have exhausted all other options? Or do you think an investigational medication should remain limited to clinical trials until the FDA has completed its review? And if you're currently taking a GLP-1 or another obesity medication, are you interested in retatrutide, or are you happy with what you're taking now? Let me know in the comments. And as always, I'm going to keep following the research and the FDA process for this medication, and I will update you as we learn more. Thank you so much for watching today, and I'll see you in the next video.